in the high mountain pass of the Sierra Nevada, where the year 184 arrived with a bite that could snap bone, a rusted iron relic sat abandoned on a spur of track that led to nowhere. It was a heavy, windowless freight car, left behind by a railroad company that had gone bankrupt before the grade was ever finished. To the few travelers moving toward the coast, it was an eyesore of peeling paint and cold metal, but to Margaret, it was the only thing she owned in the world. She didn't arrive with a caravan or a team of oxen, she arrived with a single German shepherd named Kaiser and a trunk full of wool blankets. While the people in the small mining camp 3 miles down the slope were busy reinforcing their timber cabins with mud and pine boughs, Margaret was doing something that made them pause and shake their heads in pity. She wasn't gathering wood for a massive hearth, and she wasn't digging a cellar. Instead, she was dragging heavy sacks of dry earth and river stones into the belly of that iron beast. From a distance, she looked like a woman who had lost her mind to grief, a widow toiling in a metal tomb. But if you looked closer, you would see the deliberate way she measured the distance between the iron walls and the inner frame she was constructing. She wasn't just moving in, she was building a thermal battery inside a conductor of cold. The miners would pass by and see her hauling buckets of clay from the creek bed, her face smudged with grit, her hands raw from the friction of the rope. They whispered that the iron would suck the life out of her the moment the mercury dropped, that she was building her own coffin. Margaret ignored them, her focus narrowed to the gap between the steel skin and her new interior. She knew what was coming. She had watched the elk move lower into the valleys 2 weeks earlier than usual, and she had seen the way the moss grew thick on the northern side of the boulders. The sky was a bruised purple, holding a weight that the locals didn't yet respect. She had no husband to swing an axe and no sons to haul the water, only the steady, panting presence of Kaiser and a plan that relied on physics rather than brute force. Stay with me, because the way she transformed this freezing iron shell is the only reason she didn't become a ghost of the mountain by New Year's Eve. The constraints Margaret faced were absolute and unforgiving. She had no access to a sawmill, no budget for finished lumber, and the nearest town was a day's journey through terrain that was already becoming treacherous. Her budget was exactly $0, and her tools were limited to a rusted spade, a handsaw with missing teeth, and a determination that bordered on obsession. The iron railcar was 40 feet long, but she knew she couldn't heat even a fraction of that space. Her first move was to partition off a mere 8-foot section at the very rear of the car. To do this, she didn't use thin boards that would let the heat escape, she built a double-walled bulkhead using scrap railroad ties she scavenged from the abandoned grade. She spent for days dragging those heavy, creosote-soaked beams one by one, her breath hitching in the thinning air. Between these 2 wooden walls, she packed a 6-inch layer of dry pine needles and sheep's wool she had gathered from briars in the lower pasture. This was her primary thermal break. The miners from the camp, led by a man named Miller, stopped by one afternoon, leaning against their shovels with expressions of skeptical amusement. "You're wasting your strength, Mrs. Gable," Miller called out, his voice echoing hollowly against the metal exterior. "That iron is going to radiate the frost right through those ties. You'll be a frozen statue before the 1st of the month. Come down to the camp, we've got a communal bunkhouse with a stone chimney that'll actually hold a fire." Margaret didn't stop her work. She climbed down the iron ladder, her eyes steady and tired. "A stone chimney burns through a cord of wood in a week just to keep the drafts at bay, Mr. Miller," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I don't have the back to chop a cord of wood every week. I have to keep what I catch." Miller laughed, a short, dry sound. "Keep what you catch? It's heat, not a rabbit. You can't trap it in a tin can." He shook his head and walked away, certain he was looking at a woman who had simply given up on survival. But Margaret wasn't trying to fight the cold with a bigger fire, she was trying to disappear from the cold's reach entirely. She turned back to her railcar, patting Kaiser on the head as the dog watched the men retreat. She had to finish the floor before the first flake fell, or the rising frost from the iron plates would steal the heat from her bones while she slept. The technical build began in earnest when she addressed the floor, which was nothing more than cold, bolted steel. To solve this, Margaret laid down a grid of thick branches, then filled the gaps with a mixture of wood ash and dry sand. This created a primitive but effective insulating mass. On top of this, she laid the few flat boards she had managed to pry from an old loading crate. But the real secret, the hidden action that the townspeople didn't understand was the way she treated the walls. She didn't just line them with wood. She created a dead air gap by hanging heavy, oil-soaked canvas for inches away from the iron skin, then filling that cavity with more dried vegetation. This meant that the freezing wind hitting the outside of the railcar would hit the iron, then the air gap, then the insulation, before ever reaching her living space. For her bed, she built a raised platform, not for comfort, but because she knew the coldest air would always pool on the floor. Underneath the bed, she placed 40 large river stones she had heated in a small fire outside. These stones were her thermal mass. They would absorb heat during the day and slowly release it throughout the night. It was a repeatable principle: collect energy when it's available, and store it in dense materials for when it's not. She also installed a small, cylindrical tin stove she had salvaged, but instead of venting it straight out the roof, she ran the exhaust pipe horizontally along the wall for 6 feet before it exited. This ensured that the heat from the smoke stayed inside the room longer rather than escaping immediately into the sky. Every joint was sealed with a paste made of flour, water, and wood ash, which dried as hard as plaster. She was creating a pressurized, insulated envelope within a conductive shell. As she tightened the last bolt on the door she had fashioned from 3 layers of heavy wool blankets and a wooden frame, she felt the temperature inside the small nook begin to stabilize. It was a stark contrast to the cavernous, ringing cold of the rest of the railcar. She sat on the edge of her bed, Kaiser resting his heavy head on her knee, and listened to the silence. The world outside was waiting for the hammer to fall, but inside her 8-foot sanctuary, she had created a world that didn't need the sun to stay alive. The social pressure intensified as the sky turned a leaden gray that seemed to press down on the peaks. A group of women from the mining camp made the trek up the hill, carrying a pot of stew and a sense of communal obligation. They found Margaret inside the railcar, working by the light of a single tallow candle. The interior of the car was dark and smelled of pine and damp earth. "Margaret, please," one of the women, Sarah, whispered, looking around the cramped, strange space. "This isn't right. You're living like a burrowing animal. There's no light in here, and if a heavy snow comes, you'll be buried in this metal box. How will you even breathe?" Margaret smiled softly, gestured to a small, baffled vent she had cut near the top of the bulkhead, protected by a hooded cowl on the exterior. "The air circulates because of the temperature difference, Sarah. It's safer than a drafty cabin where the wind steals the warmth from your very lungs." The women exchanged worried glances. To them, survival was about a roaring hearth and a sturdy roof that everyone could see. Margaret's solution was invisible. It was tucked behind canvas and buried under sand. "We won't be able to reach you once the drifts start," Sarah warned. "The pass will be choked. If you stay here, you're on your own." "No one is coming to dig out a railcar." Margaret reached out and took Sarah's hand. "I know you mean well, but I've spent my life tending fires that others built. For once, I've built something that doesn't ask more of me than I can give. I have my stones, I have my dog, and I have my wool. I'll be here when the spring thaws the tracks." The women left, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground, leaving Margaret in the deepening gloom. They told the men that Margaret had gone grey in the head, and they made plans to check for her body once the storms broke in a few months. They didn't understand that Margaret wasn't being stubborn, she was being precise. She had calculated her fuel needs, just 3 small logs a day to keep the stones warm, and she had enough for 4 months. She wasn't fighting the winter, she was waiting it out in a pocket of her own making. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday evening, not with a roar, but with a terrifying, absolute silence. The birds had vanished hours before, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, the first flake fell, followed by a billion more. Within 3 hours, the world disappeared. This wasn't a typical mountain snow, it was the Great Blizzard of '84, a storm that would later be recorded as one of the deadliest in the range's history. Outside, the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. In the mining camp, the sturdy timber cabins began to fail. The wind, reaching 60 miles per hour, found every crack in the mud chinking, whistling through the gaps and turning the interiors into iceboxes. The miners huddled around their massive fires, but the radiant heat only warmed their faces while their backs remained frozen. They were burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate, the heat being sucked out of the chimneys by the sheer force of the gale. Up on the spur, the iron railcar was under assault. The metal skin groaned and shrieked as the wind battered it, the sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Any other person would have been terrified by the noise, but Margaret sat in her insulated nook, wrapped in a single blanket. She checked the thermometer she had hung on the inner wall. It read 62 degrees. Outside, the iron was so cold that a drop of water would turn to ice before it hit the floor, but inside her thermal envelope, the air was still and dry. The river stones under her bed were radiating a steady, gentle warmth that defied the chaos inches away. Kaiser was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. The snow began to pile up, drifting over the sides of the railcar, eventually burying the wheels and climbing toward the roof. To an outsider, it would look like the car was being swallowed by the mountain. But to Margaret, the snow was a gift. It was the ultimate insulator. As the drifts covered the iron skin, the shrieking of the wind began to fade, replaced by a muffled, heavy quiet. The snow was trapping the last of the cold outside and sealing her warmth inside. She added one small piece of oak to her stove, watched the embers glow, and felt a sense of peace that the people in the camp, shivering despite their massive fires, would never know. She had turned her metal tomb into a fortress. By the third day of the storm, the railcar was entirely encased in a mountain of white. The world outside had ceased to exist, replaced by a dense, crystalline silence that pressed against the iron shell. Inside the living nook, Margaret lived by the rhythm of the stones. Every 6 hours, she would stoke the small tin stove just enough to keep the river rocks beneath her bed at a temperature that felt like a warm loaf of bread. She didn't need a roaring fire, she only needed to replace the tiny amount of heat that seeped through her multi-layered walls. While the miners down the slope were forced to venture out into the blinding white to retrieve frozen logs, risking frostbite and disorientation, Margaret remained in her wool-lined sanctuary. She spent her time brushing Kaiser's thick coat and reading by the soft glow of the stove's intake vent. The air remained fresh, drawn in through the baffled pipe she had carefully angled to prevent snow blockage. She was a witness to the power of thermal mass and dead air insulation. She watched the frost patterns form on the iron door of the outer car, but inside her partition, the air stayed a constant, comfortable 58 degrees. It was a measured result that defied every convention of the frontier. She was consuming less than a tenth of the fuel her neighbors were, yet she was infinitely warmer. The contrast was not just in temperature, but in the toll taken on the spirit. While the camp was in a state of high-stakes panic, Margaret was in a state of repose. Stay with me, because the moment the world finally rediscovered her, the skepticism that had defined her autumn would vanish in a single breath of warm air. The blizzard finally broke on the 7th day, leaving behind a landscape that had been reshaped into alien waves of white. In the mining camp, the situation was dire. 2 cabins had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and the communal woodpile was nearly exhausted. Miller, the man who had mocked Margaret's tin can, led a small party of survivors up the slope. They were exhausted, their faces blackened by soot and bitten by the wind. They weren't coming to rescue Margaret, they were coming to recover what they assumed would be a frozen corpse. They found the railcar only because the very tip of the stovepipe was peeking through a 10-foot drift, a thin, wispy finger of smoke rising into the blue sky. "There's no way," Miller muttered, his breath hitching in the frigid air. She'd have to be a charcoal burner to stay alive in there. They began to dig, their shovels clanging against the iron sides of the car. When they finally reached the heavy sliding door and forced it open, they were met with a wall of stagnant, freezing air from the main body of the car. "Mrs. Gable!" Miller called out, his voice cracking. "Margaret!" He stepped into the dark, hollow interior, his boots ringing on the ice-slicked metal floor. He saw the wooden bulkhead at the far end and assumed it was her coffin. But as he approached, the small door in the partition swung open. A wave of dry, scented warmth hit him in the face, the smell of pine needles, wool, and life. Margaret stood there, dressed in a simple sweater, her cheeks flushed with health. Kaiser let out a low, welcoming woof. Miller stood frozen in the doorway of the nook, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. He saw the small stove, the glowing stones, and the woman who looked as though she had spent the week in a parlor in San Francisco rather than buried under a mountain of snow. You're warm, he stammered, reaching out to touch the wooden partition. He felt the heat radiating from the wool-packed ties. We've been burning entire trees just to keep the water from freezing in the buckets, and you're sitting here in a sweater. Margaret stepped aside, inviting the shivering men into the small space. The iron is a bridge for the cold, Mr. Miller, she explained, her voice quiet and steady. I simply broke the bridge. I didn't fight the winter, I let it wrap around me. The men huddled into the nook, their frozen joints beginning to ache as the trapped heat thawed them. They looked at the river stones, the ash-plastered joints, and the horizontal stovepipe that was squeezing every last bit of energy out of the wood. One of the younger miners reached out and touched a stone. It's like the earth itself is holding the heat, he whispered. They stayed for an hour, absorbing the warmth and the lesson. They realized that their massive hearths were inefficient monsters that demanded everything and gave back little. Margaret's irrational choice had been the most logical act of survival any of them had ever witnessed. When they finally left to return to the camp, they didn't carry a body. They carried a new understanding of the environment. The story of the widow in the railcar spread quickly through the territory. What began as a tale of a crazy woman evolved into a named practice among the high-altitude settlers. They called it Gable's envelope. The following year, the mining camp didn't just build bigger cabins, they built smaller, insulated inner rooms. They began to use river stones as thermal batteries and realized that a dead-air gap was more valuable than a foot of solid timber. Margaret remained in her railcar for 3 more winters, becoming a silent authority on mountain survival. People would travel from the lower valleys just to see the iron house and ask her how she managed to stay so comfortable with so little. She always gave the same answer: nature provides the cold, but it also provides the materials to resist it. You just have to stop trying to overpower the storm and start learning how to sit inside it. Her method quietly propagated through the Sierras, saving countless lives during the brutal winters that followed. The railcar eventually rusted away long after Margaret passed, but the principle of the thermal envelope remained. It was a legacy of quiet resilience, a reminder that the most effective solutions are often the ones that others dismiss as impossible. She had proven that survival isn't a loud battle won with an axe, it's a quiet conversation won with a plan. Survival is rarely about the strength of your muscles, it is about the clarity of your observation. Margaret Gable didn't survive the Great Blizzard because she was stronger than the miners, she survived because she understood that the environment isn't an enemy to be conquered, but a set of conditions to be navigated. By identifying the constraints of her shelter and the properties of her materials, she turned a disadvantage into a fortress. She cooperated with the physics of heat and the insulating power of the very snow that threatened to bury her. This is a lesson that transcends the 1800s. Whether you are facing a literal storm or the metaphorical pressures of a modern crisis, the principle remains: break the bridges that steal your energy, and build a mass that holds your warmth. Look at the resources around you, the river stones and wool of your own life, and ask yourself how you can use them more effectively. Are you building a bigger fire, or are you building a better envelope? If this story of hidden resilience resonated with you, consider joining our community by subscribing for more narratives of historical ingenuity. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What is one irrational solution you've seen work when conventional wisdom failed? Stay prepared, stay observant, and remember that sometimes, the best way to weather the storm is to find the warmth already hidden within it.